The last nuclear bomb that could destroy what remains of humanity is under their control.
Whatever happens, Sullivan, we have to make sure that they won't get their hands on the device.
Because of human activity, the level of the world's oceans has risen dramatically. Most of the land is now underwater, and life has become a continuous struggle for land and resources. There are only 2 continents left, and a war is raging between them. In the year 2063, a military outpost is stationed in the middle of the ocean. A team of 4, who signed a 2-year contract, has been waiting for a replacement for 3 months, but for unknown reasons, it hasn't arrived. At night, the soldiers are trying to fish to provide themselves with food for the near future. A severe storm is approaching the platform, and the soldiers have to quickly pack up and get to safety before a 10-meter wave hits them. While Corporal Cassidy and Private Sullivan continue to try to haul in the fish nets, Baines goes up top. Sergeant Hendricks checks the seismograph data and warns that the team has no more than 20 minutes to avoid the storm. At one critical point, Sullivan is violently washed away by a massive wave, causing him to lose his grip on the crucial fish net. Realizing that their survival depends on retrieving it, he desperately tries to grab and hold onto the net, but the worsening storm intensifies the situation. Cassidy, unable to assist the struggling private, makes a swift decision to head to the lift. The enormous wave is getting perilously close, and the platform is literally shaking from the ferocity of the approaching storm. Furniture starts sliding uncontrollably, and dishes crash to the ground, a stark reminder to the team that they need to reach safety as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Baines meticulously checks the security of the nuclear bomb and secures the most critical components to protect them from the wave's devastating impact. At the same time, Baines notices that the platform's shaking has caused a pipe to rupture. The outpost begins to slowly sink from the inside, and he, as the mechanic, tries to fix the issue. While trying to repair the damage, Baines gets his hand stuck between the pipes and becomes trapped. With the water continuing to rise, he could drown at any moment, but he manages to free himself and close the breach. Sullivan doesn't let go of the fish net and even manages to hook it so they can lift the catch onto the platform. Realizing that time is running out and the storm is about to hit, Sullivan hastily climbs the ladder but slips, almost falling. Just barely catching himself, he climbs up seconds before the 10-meter wave crashes down on them. Lifting the hook, the team is disheartened to find that their catch was lost. The next morning, the team returns to their regular duties. Baines checks the equipment and engine with intense focus, while Sergeant Hendricks works with the nuclear weapon, detecting an escalating level of radioactive danger. Meanwhile, Sullivan attempts to prepare breakfast for the team but struggles due to the severe lack of fresh water. Upon discovering that the problem is a missing piece of crucial pipe, he becomes frustrated and angry with the mechanic, not understanding that Baines is trying to patch up leaks with makeshift materials that need complete replacement and better maintenance. During breakfast, the corporal and sergeant note that the storm is approaching faster each time, leaving them with less and less time for outings and food procurement. Baines is worried that they might not be replaced, but Sullivan doubts whether anyone will replace them at all. The tension among the team members is understandable, given that they have been waiting for a rotation for 3 months. Some have lost faith, while others want to contact higher-ups to get answers and clarity on the situation. Sergeant Hendricks, who has experienced the Continental War, strictly adheres to the rules and reminds everyone that communication with headquarters is only possible in case of incidents. Baines and Sullivan argue over having to eat cheap instant food instead of fish, but the corporal and sergeant are far more concerned about the rising radiation levels. Cassidy understands they need iodine baths weekly, but their supply is also running low. Reporting on the platform's condition, Baines notes that the desalination unit and generator are malfunctioning, and the outpost is listing a few degrees, making it at risk of sinking at any moment. Trying to stay hopeful, the team returns to their tasks. Stationed equidistantly between the 2 remaining continents, their sole duty is to guard the last nuclear bomb to prevent it from destroying what remains of humanity. Sullivan, as usual, receives a radio signal and sends a brief response, recording everything in the logbook. Attempting to be helpful, Sullivan glues together the corporal's broken mug, but it still leaks. Sergeant Hendricks is the only one maintaining military discipline and not allowing others to break the rules. Noticing an inflatable doll, he asks Sullivan to remove it, but the private is reluctant to destroy the last reminder of a peaceful and carefree life on the mainland. Using binoculars, Sullivan spots a slowly approaching ship in the distance and reports it to the sergeant. The corporal sees the ship on the radar and reports its key parameters. Sullivan optimistically assumes it might be their replacement, but the sergeant orders the preparation of ammunition for an attack on the vessel. Activating the alert on the outpost, Hendricks prepares to attack, suspecting the ship might be an enemy vessel. Cassidy communicates with the crew via radio and then uses the loudspeaker, but there are no signs of life from the ship. Before opening fire, the sergeant sends Sullivan on a reconnaissance mission, giving him his pistol. Baines stays by the artillery, ready to respond in case it's a trap and Sullivan is taken out. The sergeant specifically sent him alone, anticipating this outcome and believing that 3 survivors would be enough to guard the nuclear bomb. Taking a motorboat, Sullivan approaches the ship and thoroughly inspects it. Finding no crew, he boards the vessel and temporarily turns off the radio, as its noise attracts attention. Carefully checking each cabin and room, Sullivan confirms that the ship is empty but stocked with food, several barrels of iodine, and equipment for 4 soldiers. He suspects this might be the replacement ship, but for some unknown reason, the crew has disappeared without a trace. The sergeant calls Sullivan, but he doesn't respond. Suspecting that the private might have been captured or eliminated, Hendricks begins to follow protocol. He requests a second key from Cassidy to activate the nuclear bomb. Determined not to lose it in a battle with the enemy, Hendricks decides to use the only weapon capable of destroying what remains of humanity. He goes through all the activation procedures and starts the countdown. But just then, Sullivan finally replies, reporting that the ship is empty. Canceling the attack protocol, Hendricks takes the second key for himself, as hesitation and indecision in a crisis are unacceptable. To relieve the overwhelming stress from the recent events, Cassidy and Sullivan retreat to one of the secluded cabins. The group soon reunites to take necessary iodine baths to protect themselves from radiation. As they discuss the unsettling events, the soldiers suggest reporting everything immediately to headquarters, but the sergeant again hesitates to communicate with higher-ups. Hendricks realizes that empty, abandoned ships don't just show up randomly and wants to gather crucial information to understand how a military vessel ended up near their platform and which distant continent it came from. While Sullivan continues to send radio signals and receives the same repetitive responses as before, Hendricks asks Baines to urgently restore power to the ship. After carefully checking the navigator's data, the sergeant meticulously transcribes the information to study the ship's route in detail. Later, Sullivan gives Cassidy a metal sphere resembling Earth before the global war and informs him that he has sent a crucial message to headquarters, hoping they will respond soon and clarify the increasingly dire situation. The next morning, Sullivan attempts to make contact for another message. The whole team gathers, hoping for a response from headquarters, but they only receive a duplicate of their previous message. The military personnel assume that no one received the message and it was returned. This leads them to think that central headquarters might be destroyed or that they could be the only ones left on Earth. Isolated from society, the 4 are uncertain about their next steps. The corporal tries not to panic, believing that the base's receiver might be broken and that it's a temporary problem that will be resolved soon. Sullivan continues to speculate that the enemy might have passed by and reached the continent, destroying the remnants of humanity, but Cassidy refuses to believe such a scenario. At night, Baines secretly boards the ship to repair it and prepare it for sailing. Baines and Sullivan, who have difficulty getting along, decide to bond over alcohol. During their conversation, the mechanic suggests that the enemy may no longer exist, as no one has heard of people from the other continent for over 40 years. The military forces are used as a deterrent but lack real goals and objectives. Sullivan considers the opposite possibility, but Baines explains that the nuclear bomb is powerful enough to sink both continents. The private is shocked by this revelation but is more concerned about the innocent animals, fish, and birds than about the people who have lost their principles and humanity. At night, Sullivan tells Cassidy about Baines repairing the ship and the possibility of escaping the platform. The private suggests they start a new life together in a city with gas, water, and electricity still available. Cassidy would be happy to join him, but she realizes that Hendricks would never agree to leave the nuclear bomb unattended. Sullivan proposes convincing the sergeant to change his mind or they could leave him behind and escape as a trio. The next morning, Baines completes the ship repairs successfully, but Hendricks orders the immediate dismantling of the vessel, turning it into scrap metal. Baines and Sullivan decide to ignore the sergeant's order, but Hendricks soon changes his mind. He is willing to let 2 of them leave, but someone must stay behind to guard the platform. The corporal volunteers, but Sullivan suggests Cassidy take his place. Cassidy, understanding that this decision is driven by emotions, insists that their personal relationship shouldn't interfere with their duties, and she prefers to part ways. She claims she has no real feelings for Sullivan and used him for her own desires. This devastates Sullivan psychologically, and he decides to leave the platform as soon as possible. That evening, he and Baines pack their belongings and receive a letter from the sergeant addressed to headquarters with a detailed report of the events. At night, Hendricks continues meticulously studying the map and the ship's drift before it reached their platform. Noticing several anomalies, he is unsure whom to consult as he doesn't trust anyone on the team. As dawn approaches, he and the vigilant corporal spot a ship on the radar within range. Declaring a full alert, Hendricks orders the artillery to be rapidly charged and fired upon. The ship is too close but obscured by thick fog, leaving no time for communication attempts. Baines misses the first crucial shot and reloads, while Cassidy and Sullivan realize in disbelief that the ship is moving away. Moments later, they realize that it's their own ship that Hendricks had sent adrift to prevent anyone from leaving the platform. Hendricks's orders are not followed, so he threatens the team with his weapon. After firing a warning shot at the inflatable doll, he shoots Baines in the ear when he refuses to destroy the ship. Realizing that the sergeant is serious about continuing to fire, Sullivan launches a second, successful shell. The ship catches fire and sinks, leaving the team with no chance to leave the platform until a second ship arrives. This triggers Baines' aggression, and he is ready to attack the armed Hendricks. Knowing the sergeant will shoot, Cassidy hits him on the back of the head. The trio then locks Hendricks in a secure room, taking the keys to the nuclear weapon control panel from him. Baines is beside himself over what happened and wants to execute the sergeant for robbing them of their hope for a normal life and a return to the mainland. The crew falls into depression, and the command keeps failing to make contact, which only worsens the situation. Baines refuses to stand watch and spirals into alcoholism, forcing Cassidy and Sullivan to work 12-hour shifts. The private is willing to check all radio channels in hopes of reaching someone who might hear them. Later, Sullivan brings food to the sergeant, who reveals his discovery. After closely studying the ship's movements, he learned that it was heading towards them but changed course at the last moment, sailing just a few miles from the platform. The ship stayed put, as if it had arrived at its destination, then began drifting and eventually came into view 3 months later. Given these details, Hendricks suspects that there's a traitor among their team who deliberately led the replacements on a false course. Attempts to urgently contact command or anyone else fail. Amidst this, Cassidy shares a poignant story about the only cherished childhood photo she has, showing her blissfully happy with her parents. It was raining heavily outside, but her family was incredibly joyful to be together. Shortly after, Cassidy was tragically sent to a camp, and her family was caught in the middle of relentless carpet bombings, leaving her orphaned. The next morning, Sullivan decides to reconcile with Baines but finds that he has emptied all the bottles of alcohol and wreaked massive havoc in his workshop. Meanwhile, Baines aggressively attacks Cassidy and tries to strangle her. She manages to narrowly escape, but the frantic mechanic takes the keys to the nuclear weapon control panel. While Sullivan and Cassidy urgently return to the bridge, Baines manages to hastily start the activation of the nuclear bomb. The deluded mechanic is convinced he's doing the world a favor by eliminating humanity, but the determined corporal and the private persuade him to calm down and stop the process. At one tense moment, Baines relents, but only because he has forgotten the critical last digit of the code needed to activate the nuclear weapon. After the incident, Sullivan decides to release the sergeant so the team can discuss everything and find a solution. However, Baines reports that Hendricks is no longer with them. According to the mechanic, the sergeant could not accept the team's decision and, after breaking a window, jumped into the water to end his life. Later, Sullivan reads a letter the sergeant had given him before they were about to leave. It turns out that the sergeant, more than anyone else, was devoted to his duty. He had been there not for 2, but for 8 years, trying to atone for his sins and correct the mistakes of the past. Soon, another storm approaches the platform. Before they are engulfed by the wave, Cassidy suggests going to retrieve some plastic located nearby in the open ocean. Baines accompanies her, but the corporal and the private do not trust the mechanic. Sullivan hands Cassidy a weapon and advises her to defend herself if necessary. Left alone on the platform, Sullivan checks Baines' workspace and realizes that the mechanic is doing a great job. Instead of causing sabotage, he continues repairing the pipes, ensuring their fresh water supply, and correcting the platform's tilt. While Baines and Cassidy collect the plastic, Sullivan pulls up the net and finds the sergeant's body tangled in it. From the bullet wound, he realizes that Hendricks did not take his own life but was coldly eliminated. Checking the ship's route again, Sullivan understands that someone on the team deliberately led him off course. Inspecting the radio beacon, the private deduces that it was placed in a boat and used to indicate the ship's course, causing the vessel with the replacements to pass by the platform. Sullivan realizes that someone stole the beacon that night 3 months ago, lured the other troops into a trap, and then coldly eliminated them by dumping their bodies into the water. Reviewing the shift log, he discovers that it was not the previously suspected Baines, but Cassidy behind this. At the same time, the corporal returns to the platform and somberly reports that the mechanic drowned while trying to retrieve the crucial plastic. The next morning, Cassidy wakes up alone in bed and cannot find Sullivan anywhere. The private, hiding from her and communicating only via radio, reveals his suspicion that the corporal is the real traitor. Remembering her story about her family, Sullivan realizes that there was never any rain on his mainland, and that Cassidy was referring to the enemy continent. She had intended to acquire the nuclear weapon to ensure victory in the ongoing war, but Sullivan cannot allow her plans to come to fruition. Instead, he has stealthily stolen the control keys and activated the nuclear bomb. Not willing to listen to her desperate excuses or allow her to interfere, Sullivan releases the button, bracing for the explosion, but nothing happens. Instead, the display shows a chilling message stating that animals, birds, and fish do not deserve destruction. only humans do. Both Sullivan and Cassidy realize that Baines managed to sabotage the nuclear weapon to save the world, but it still poses a grave threat. Leaving the secrets behind, the pair decides to join forces to protect the nuclear bomb from the advancing military forces of both continents. Do you think anyone needs a force like a nuclear bomb? Share your thoughts in the comments down below, give a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next videos.